The Departments of Homeland Security, Defense, Health and Human Services, and Agriculture regularly run interagency exercises to test preparedness for biological attacks. But the Government Accountability Office says the COVID-19 pandemic showed a lack of action in response. Currie is Director of Emergency Management, Disaster Recovery, and DHS Management Issues at GAO. Chris, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
GAO's report says that there were 74 interagency biological incident exercises that federal agencies conducted over a 10-year time span. This goes back to 2009. How effective were those exercises in preparing the government for the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, it's interesting. The exercises themselves were pretty good. What we found was that in many cases, the exercises had identified the exact type of challenges and gaps that we saw actually happen in the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, some of the exercises had found that there was going to be a large-scale coordination challenge between federal agencies not knowing what to do with such a large disaster and pandemic. They also identified that knowing what the state and local capabilities were going to be in such an event was going to be a challenge as well. So the exercises did their job. The problem is that we didn't actually follow up on the gaps that were identified and close those before the pandemic happened.
So what would you have liked to see come out of those exercises that would have put the federal government in a better position to deal with the pandemic?
Well, this is something we see a lot in the emergency management world, which is exercises are done and often after something really bad happens in real life, after action reports are done. But then we move on and we don't follow up on the gaps and we don't identify who's supposed to close those gaps. So a couple things. First of all, we need to define the capabilities in the future that are needed to prepare for something like this. And then we need to actually close the gaps when we identify them and find the agencies that are accountable for doing that and follow up.
So you had mentioned before that there was a lack of communication and deficiencies in how agencies actually communicated with each other. How can they improve the way they communicate the results and recommendations of their future exercises?
Well, first of all, they need to address what was actually identified during these exercises. So, for example, in 2019, there was a large-scale exercise conducted called Crimson Contagion. It actually tested a large flu pandemic across the country and identified that at the beginning of that, which federal agencies were supposed to take charge and take what action was going to be a challenge. So, if we're going to spend the money and take the time to actually do the exercises and identify these gaps and challenges, then we better follow up and close them in the future before these things happen.
Sure. So what does the GAO recommend a mechanism to ensure that agencies do that follow-up after exercises and implement changes?
That's what we recommended in this report. We actually have 16 recommendations. Four are unique, and they're to each of the four agencies that you talked about up front. But the first step is define the capabilities that we really need to test for future pandemics or biological events. The second step is communicate that to federal, state, and local partners to figure out what needs to be done. And then lastly, do the exercises and follow up and determine who's accountable for closing the gaps when they're identified.
Chris, we talked about, these biological exercises, and you did talk about a large-scale flu pandemic there was an exercise for that. What other types of biological incidents are we talking about here besides a pandemic?
That's a great question. The big thing we looked at here were what we call national events. So things that are going to affect most of the country. This one of the problems is in the past, at least in the recent past, a lot of pandemic and public health emergencies were very local. So think things like Zika or, certain flu might have broken out in certain parts of the country. The COVID-19 pandemic was a nationwide, worldwide event. So it's been 100 years since we had something like that. So part of the, this also includes biological events from terrorism. This could be a man-made event. So anything that has a cascading effect and could potentially affect the whole country is what we looked at.
So we're talking about diseases, we're talking about terrorism, biological terror attacks, also accidental incidents. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. I mean, you could have an accidental outbreak from a lab breach or something getting out of a lab and infecting anybody in different parts of the country. And one important thing to think about here is that You know, the cascading effects of this were huge. I mean, obviously the death count is massive, but even an event like this, if the death count is not massive, it can have huge psychological impacts and economic impacts, and it's really a homeland security issue at large.
So what will you keep track of as agencies continue to develop these exercises, these routines?
Good question. So there is actually already a biological defense strategy, a biodefense strategy across the whole of federal government. We think that these recommendations we made in this report needs to be integrated into the mechanism for implementing that. So there's a steering committee made up of the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, Agriculture, and Health and Human Services. And we want to see the capabilities developed as part of that effort, exercised, and then followed up on. So that's what we'll be watching for.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks so much for being on the program. I appreciate it. And let's stay in touch on these issues.
Thank you very much.